The rise of Islam begins with the Prophet Muhammad. But the question you have to ask yourself is, where do we get our sources or our information about Muhammad? And you might be surprised to find out that the Quran doesn't say much about Muhammad at all. You see, the Quran is a series of recitations, some revelations that Muhammad claimed to receive from God, which he then recited to his followers. And eventually, after his followers memorized it, and after his death, they compiled them, they put them into writing and compiled them in what we know today as the Quran. But the Quran doesn't say much about Muhammad at all. And so where do we get our information about Muhammad? Well, there are two primary sources. The first one is what we call sirah, and those are pretty much biographies of Muhammad. Well, the first biographies of Muhammad came about 200 years after his death. And so he died around 632, and these biographies are going to be written around 830. So that's 200 years after his death. There's a second source where we get our information about Muhammad, and it's called the Hadith. And the Hadith is basically a compilation of sayings, teachings, or stories about the life of Muhammad. And the first Hadith were written about 870 AD. That's about 240 years after his death. Now, if that's true, that our stories, our knowledge of Muhammad comes about 240 years after his death, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we know that these stories are true? How do we know they're not made up? You know, it wasn't written by eyewitnesses, and that's a big challenge. And I think that Muslims sometimes they pretend that they know better than we do about the historicity of these events. But I want you to consider what we know about the life of Jesus, to compare it to what we know about the life of Muhammad. So do you know how many years after the death of Jesus were the biographies about Jesus written? So the Gospels, you have the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Do you know how many years after the death of Jesus these biographies were written? Well, at most, it was only a few decades after his death. And certainly we know that it was within the lifetime of those who were actually eyewitnesses, those who had been with Jesus, those who had eaten with him, those who had heard his teachings, seen his miracles, who had touched him. These are the people who wrote the biographies of Jesus Christ. Now, when you compare the two, you have to ask yourself, okay, how can we be so critical of what we believe about Jesus and yet give a pass to Muslims about what they claim about Muhammad? And I think there's a little bit of discrepancy here. And as Christians, we should be proud of the fact that what we have recorded about Jesus was recorded by eyewitnesses. It was recorded really close to the date of these events when it happened. And so that's something we should be proud of. So going back to Islam, like I said, the sources for the stories about Muhammad, they come from the Sirah, from the Hadith. And, if we were to look at them honestly, we would probably conclude that there are some fabrications, there are some exaggerations. And so how do we distinguish between what is true and what isn't? And it's really hard to do that, to be honest. And of course, your bias is going to show in what you accept, what you reject. Whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, your bias is going to come into your interpretation of these sources. And so what I'm going to do for you is that I'm going to try to stick to the bare bones of the story about Muhammad, so that we can kind of stick to the things that probably have some historicity, probably are true or not just made up. I'm not going to go into all the glorious accounts of his life that are meant to make him look so good, like, this super honorable man that did everything right, and, that we should be looking up to, because I suspect that a lot of these stories are made up or at least exaggerated. And so I'm going to stick to the bare bones, just enough for you to have an understanding of his life and an understanding of how Islam started. But even then, how do you know how much of it is historical? You're going to have to decide. You're going to have to be the judge of these things. To be honest, I don't know for sure, but use your critical thinking skills. Use your own mind, your own reasoning, rational, to be able to make a decision about these things. But let's go back to the beginning. Muhammad was born around the year 570 AD in the Arabian Peninsula, or at least in the Near East, as far as I can tell. And what we know about his upbringing is that his father and his mother died when he was very young. And so by the age of 6, he had lost both parents, and eventually he was taken care of by his uncle, a man who is named Abu Talib. And Abu Talib to Muslims is very important because when you look at, there are certain key figures that are going to have a huge impact upon his life, and that's going to be one of those people. And so he will be raised by his uncle, and he will start taking care of some of the trading business. And tradition tells us that he was a very honorable man, that he was fair, that he was honest, that he was wise. He did a great job, and people looked up to him, and people respected him. Muslims tell us, according to the traditions, that whenever he met people, people were so impressed with him because he was a very honorable man. And in fact, the story is that he was so honorable that this old widow took notice of him, a widow by the name of Khadija. And Khadija, apparently she was 40 years old, I think, at the time, and she was very beautiful, and men wanted to marry her after she lost her husband, but she wouldn't marry anyone until she met Muhammad. And because he was so honorable, she asked Muhammad to marry her. And so it wasn't even Muhammad who proposed, it was Khadija who proposed to Muhammad and said, "Can you please take me as your wife?" And so that's kind of a story that shows how honorable apparently he was. And so he got married to Khadija at first. And it's during that time that he's going to have his first revelations. This is how the story goes. The first time Muhammad received revelations was in 610 AD. So he was about 40 years of age. And the story goes that he went into a cave near Mecca, and he was meditating. He just wanted to be at peace, to be away from all the violence and the corruption in the city. And then apparently an angel came up to him. And the angel claimed to be Gabriel and told Muhammad to recite. And at first, Muhammad refused. He was confused. He didn't know what to do. He didn't want to do it. And so the angel repeated, recite. And he claims that he felt like his body was being crushed, you know. And so Muhammad was really shaken by that incident. And so when he went back home, he told his wife what happened. And he was afraid that he was actually possessed by a demon. And his wife reassured him. His wife said, "No, you're a righteous man. You're a good person. There's no way that this could happen to you, that an evil spirit could take you. This must be God." And so both of them became convinced that God was revealing himself to Muhammad. And so from that time on, he will receive more revelations, more recitations. And so he's going to bring this message to people, and he's going to be convinced that he is a prophet sent by God. And he's going to tell people about these recitations. The message that Muhammad received through those revelations, and which he was told to recite and which he recited to his followers, is pretty simple message. Basically, it's a message against idolatry. And so there's only one God. That's the core message that he's going to be preaching, is that you should stop worshiping these false gods, these idols, and you should only worship the one true God, who is called Allah. Allah basically means the God in Arabic. So it's like, this is the God. Don't worship the false gods, only worship the one true God, Allah. And so that's going to be the main message. And so he's going to tell people to repent of idolatry, to repent of their evil ways, and to only worship the one true God. And there's going to be a message of warning that those who refuse to repent in the end will perish in hell. It's a very simple message. And in fact, if you read the Quran for yourself, like I did, you will find this message comes over and over and over again. In fact, I remember when I read through the Quran, I thought it was pretty redundant. And there are so many stories, so many characters that come up in the Quran, and all of these characters all have the same message. They all say the same thing, and some of them actually come from the Bible. There's a lot of stories in the Quran that are biblical characters, but the words that are placed in their mouths sound an awful lot like what Muhammad was saying in the 7th century. And they all sound like they're from that period in time. And as opposed, when you read the Bible, that's something that's amazing. You know how sometimes when you read the Old Testament, for example, they're going to do things that are strange to you, or they're going to say things that are strange to you, or they're going to think in ways that seem so foreign to you. And sometimes you wonder, like, how, what am I supposed to do with all of this? It seems so foreign, and it should, because it was written so long ago, and people thought differently back then, and people acted differently back then. And that's one of the marks of the historicity of the Bible, is that it feels old, it feels strange when you read it, because you live in a such different time and culture. But when you look at the Quran, you look at all these recitations, all of these characters, no matter what time frame they're supposed to be from, they all sound the same. They all say the same thing, all have the same message. And so that's kind of the basic message that Muhammad will be preaching to his followers. Of course, that message won't be popular at first, because you might remember what I said before, that back then there was a lot of idolatry. The people around the Arabian Peninsula, around the Near East, they had a lot of idols. And so when Muhammad will come and preach this message against idolatry, some people are going to get really upset. And so, in fact, they will get so angry, they will oppose him, they will start fighting him, and he will have to flee from Mecca. Again, let me just put a reminder right there. We don't know for sure if Mecca truly is the original city of Muhammad and where all these things took place.